So let's start with line by line explanation of page 57. Very clear? Now just let us start. Before that, I want to give a micro introduction of our previous lecture. Two main characters, Mr. Lamb, an old man, very pessimistic, and on the contrary, a teenager, Derek or Derry, physically handicapped, and that is why he was pessimistic. No doubt Mr. Lamb was also physically handicapped, but he was enthusiastic and he was optimist. I think very clear up to this particular point. Let us start from the point where we had left our previous lecture. Page 57, dear students. Derry, angry, you were watching me. Just look at very fine dialogue of Derry. That teenager, he became very angry. He was highlighting that particular point that was Mr. Lamb watching him. Why was he angry at this moment, at this particular point? Already told you people that that fellow never wanted anybody to just interfere in his pessimism. He never wanted. So that is why while he had listened the point from Mr. Lamb that Mr. Lamb was watching him, he became irritated, angry. He had highlighted that particular point, you were watching me. In an angry mode, he had highlighted that particular point. Now look at next, Mr. Lamb, I saw you. Mr. Lamb had declared that particular point that he had seen him. But the gates open. All welcome. You are welcome. I sit here. I like sitting. Very confident personality. He said he had seen him. Also, he had added that to that particular point that the gate was open. Again, highlighted the point that everybody was welcomed in that particular garden. And again, just look at Mr. Lamb wanted to highlight that particular point that he was also welcomed at that particular place. So highlighted the point that he sat there because he likes sitting. He wanted to highlight that particular point that he was in the garden. He was not inside the house because he used to love nature. So that is why he wanted to highlight that particular point that he had just declared that particular point. He had declared that particular point that he was very happy in the garden because he wanted to enjoy nature. Because that was very fine day, he never wanted to go inside the house. Very clear. Daddy. I had not come to steal anything. Just look at Daddy was quite irritated here. So that is why he was declaring that particular point that he had not come to steal anything in the garden. Steal, I think very clear up to this particular word, this is a very easy word. He had declared that particular point that he had not entered the garden by thinking that particular point that he would steal apples or anything. Mr. Lamb, no, the young lad steal, scrum the apples, you are not so young. But the beauty of this dialogue, Mr. Lamb, highlighting that particular point in negative. What was the point? While this point was highlighted by Derek, that he had not come to steal anything in over there. Mr. Lamb wanted to look at the point in a very different way. He was endorsing dairy at that moment. He was saying, no, never. He had never thought on that particular point that he would enter that particular garden for stealing anything. Now, again, Mr. Lamb was declaring the young lads means boys. To highlight that particular point that small kids just steal. So count the apples. Just look at this word. Count means to steal. But it is informal word for stealing. It's not used for formal discussions or formal dialogues. Very clear up to this particular point. Wanted to highlight that particular point that young children just enter, young boys enter, and they just steal apples. That highlighted that particular point that Derek was not so small, so young, because he was teenager. Very clear. Now just look at the next. Derek, I just dash wanted to come into the garden. Just look at the explanation of dairy. Just look at the dialogue of dairy or Derek here. He wanted to just highlight that particular point that he just wanted to enter into the garden. Come in or into the garden. Now just look at the beauty of these two prepositions, in versus into. Note it down. In means within, inside of anything. And if we look at this preposition into, it means when someone or something comes from outside to inside. Derek wanted to enter into the garden. He wanted to highlight that particular point. In versus into, I think these two prepositions are very clear. In means inside or within. And if we look at this, into, it means when someone or something comes from outside to inside. Very clear up to this particular point. Here, Derek wanted to highlight that particular point that he wanted to enter into the garden. Very clear. Now, just look at the next dialogue of Mr. Lamb. Mr. Lamb. So you did. Here we are then. Wanted to highlight the particular point that you wanted to enter the garden and you had entered into the garden. In the garden. Very clear up to this particular point. Here we are. You wanted to highlight that particular point that they were there. Both were there. He wanted to highlight that particular point that he wanted to enter into the garden. He had already in that particular garden, and now he wanted to highlight that particular point that they are in front of each other. Very clear up to this particular point. There is no doubt in that. She don't know who I am. Look at the words of Daddy. He wanted to highlight the point that Mr. Lamb, who he was. Yeah, Derek wanted to highlight that particular point, and Mr. Lamb was not able to get the introduction of that particular fellow about him. Very clear up to this particular point. There is no doubt. Mr. Lamb, a boy, 13 or so. Mr. Lamb was replying in a very positive way. He was saying, yes, you are a guy, you are a boy, and your age maybe 13 or so. Wanted to highlight that particular point was teenager. Mr. Lamb wanted to highlight that particular point that Derek was teenager. 13 or so, about Due to technical trouble, there was little bit gap. So dear students, be in continuity with the things. And due to weak internet or whatever the problem was, that was technical problem. Now be in continuity. Delhi, 14 was. He had announced that particular point that he was 14-year-old. Then pause. But I have got to go now. Stopped for a moment, and he had announced that particular point that he was moving immediately. Goodbye. Let it. Goodbye. Goodbye. I think you are very clear while we are meeting somebody for the last time, and we are just highlighting this. Last wish. I think very clear, Mr. Lamb. Nothing to be afraid of. Just a garden, just me. Mr. Lamb wanted to highlight that particular point that nothing was there to be afraid of. Derry wanted to highlight that particular guy that was able to get open environment. Nothing to be afraid of. I think very clear, just a garden, just me. That highlighted that particular point that nobody was there in that particular garden. And again, he was adding to that particular sentence or that dialogue that he was all alone in the garden. Wanted to highlight that particular point that was in the garden, he and garden, and nobody else was there in that particular garden. He wanted to highlight the point. So that is why Mr. Lamb was just consoling that guy by highlighting that particular point that he must not be fearful. But I'm not dash dash dash. I'm not afraid. Pause. People are afraid of me. But highlighted that particular point. Very. And highlighted that he was not afraid. Never felt fearful at any moment. Again, he paused and highlighted that particular point that people used to be afraid of him. He had highlighted that particular. Mr. Lamb, why should that be? Look at the query of Mr. Lamb here. He wanted to highlight that particular point. What was the reason the people to be afraid of that? He wanted to highlight that particular point. He want to make a query, inquiry. Derek. Everyone is. Just look at the words of Derek. He was saying everybody. It doesn't matter who they are. He wanted to highlight that particular point that everyone on this particular planet used to be afraid of him. And again, he was adding to that particular dialogue that it didn't matter who they are. It didn't matter who they were or what they said or how they looked. How they pretend, I know, I can see. Pretend, I think you should be, you are very clear about this particular word. Pretend is to show something to be true, knowing it to be false. While we are very clear about that particular point that something is not true, and we are just making fictitious actions and reaction to highlight that that particular thing is really true. I think very clear. Pretend. So just look at the words of Derek here. He was planet. Be afraid of him. A gap. So be in continuity, dear students. So Derry wanted to highlight that particular point that everybody on this planet used to afraid of him. And he wanted to highlight that particular point that he could be able to observe everybody. And he was declaring that particular point that he knew it well, that nobody used to be happy to look at him. Very clear, Mr. Lamb. Why should that be? Look at the query of Mr. Lamb. He wanted to inquire what was the reason of why people got afraid of him. He wanted to highlight that particular point. He wanted to make a query. Everyone is. It doesn't matter who they are or what they say and how they look, how they pretend. I know I can see. See what? Very clear up to this particular point. Just look at the query of Mr. Lamb again. He wanted to highlight that particular point. See what? This particular dialogue is interconnected to the dialogue of Derek. I can see. So here Mr. Lamb wanted to inquire, what could he see? Very clear up to this particular point. Derek, what they think? Derek wanted to highlight that particular point, that he was able to read what the people think to look at him. Mr. Lamb, what do they think then? Again, just look at the next query of Mr. Lamb. He wanted to highlight that particular point. What did the people think to look at that particular fellow? Then you think here is a boy, you look at me, and then you see my face and you think that's bad. That's a terrible thing. That's the ugliest thing. Now just look at. Derry wanted to highlight that particular point. He wanted to answer the query of Mr. Lamb in a very different way. Wanted to highlight that, you think. Wanted to highlight particular point that Mr. Lamb, he think like that. There was a boy, and Mr. Lamb looked at him, and then Mr. Lamb would be able to observe his face, and Mr. Lamb will think, oh, that was bad. That is a terrible thing. That is the ugliest thing I ever saw. You think, poor boy, but I'm not poor. Underneath, you are afraid anybody would be. I am. When I look in the mirror and see it, I am afraid of me. Just look at the dialogue of Derek. It was very genuine. Just highlighting his problem, genuine problem in very fine words, very practical way. Wanted to answer the query of Mr. Lamb, that if Mr. Lamb would be able to observe him, and after observing his face, he would be able to think on that particular point that that was very negative, that Derek was a poor boy, pessimistic boy, helpless boy. And here, Derek wanted to highlight that particular point, that he was not pessimistic, he was not poor. Underneath, note down the meaning of underneath. Underneath means under the layer of something. Underneath, you are afraid. He wanted to highlight that particular point, that underneath, Mr. Lamb was afraid to observe his face. And anybody would be, he wanted to highlight that particular point, anybody would feel like that. He was. He wanted to highlight that particular point. He was afraid of himself also. How? When he looked in the mirror and just looked at his face, was afraid of himself. Here he wanted to highlight the pessimistic condition of part of his face which was damaged, which was with scar. Very clear up to this particular point. There is no doubt of that. I think very clear. Now look at the next page. Mr. Lamb. No, note the whole of you. Note of you. At the positive nature of Mr. Lamb here. No, he wanted to highlight the particular point that no, not at all. No doubt if the part of his face was in damaged condition, it didn't mean that he was handicapped entirely. Not the whole of you, I think very clear. Not a few. Yes. There he was feeling very negative over here. So that is why sign of exclamation is there, dear students. Pause. Mr. Lamb later on, when it's a bit cooler, I'll get the ladder and a stick and pull down those crab apples. They're ripe for it. I make jelly. It's a good time of year, September. Look at them, orange and golden. The magic fruit. I often say, but it's best picked and made into jelly. You could give me a hand. Just look at the dialogue of Mr. Lamb here. Words of Mr. Lamb here. These words are highlighting very fine character trait of Mr. Lamb, that he was very confident. He used to love everybody. That is why he never wanted to elaborate the negative point highlighted by Derry. And Derry had highlighted negativity of his face. Mr. Lamb had changed the topic because he never wanted that guy should feel upset. Just converted the topic, highlighting about the garden and apple. Just look at it. Later on, when it's a bit cooler, I will get the ladder and a stick and pull down those crab apples. He wanted to highlight his next action. Then while there will be evening, a bit cooler, or might be it was summer day, and automatically heat of sun rays were there. And due to that particular environment, he could not be able to look at that particular assignment. Wanted to highlight that particular point, that while it will be a bit cooler means while there will be beginning of evening, he would get the ladder. He would be able to get the ladder and a stick, and he would just look at his assignment of pulling crab apples. Wanted to highlight the particular point that they were ripe for it. Would be able to make jelly. I think jelly you are very clear. Wanted to highlight that particular point that it is very fine time of the year, September. Wanted to highlight that particular point that September month is really good to look at very fine apples. Look at them. He wanted to highlight that particular point. He wanted to instruct Derek here. Wanted to highlight that, look at them. Look at the apples, orange and golden. Again, he was highlighting that really a magic fruit. We look at apples. Apples are really very fine fruit. It's rightly said that an apple a day keeps a doctor away. If we eat an apple daily, could never ever be in the requirement to move towards the doctor, because we would be fit and fine. So look at this life skill. Apple a day keeps a doctor away. So we must be able to get enjoyment of this fruit daily in order to stay normal. I think very clear up to this particular point. You must have noted down this particular life skill. You wanted to highlight that particular point that really was a magic fruit. I often say, if we look at this, I often say, we usually speak the same. He frequently declare the same, that really apple is a very fine fruit, but it's best picked and made into jelly. You could give me a hand. Wanted to highlight that particular point, that they are in a very fine state, means they are ripe for making a jelly. No doubt, crab apples were there, but that was uh, the time to pluck the apples from the tree and make jelly. There, otherwise, it would never be possible. First, if we want to make jelly, we require crab apples, juicy apples. Very clear? Here, he wanted to instruct one more point. Could give me a hand. He wanted help from Derek. Wanted to highlight that particular point that Mr. Derek could assist him in that particular task of plucking the apples from the tree. Very clear up to this particular point. In other words, he had changed the topic. He never wanted to elaborate the negative point highlighted by Derek at this particular moment. Very clear. Because he never wanted to make that guy upset. By elaborating that point of his negativity, I think you are able to learn very fine life skill. Then, what have you changed the subject for? Just look at the query of Derry. Wanted to inquire, what have you changed the subject for? He wanted to make a query that why had Mr. Lamb changed the subject, changed the topic? Why had Mr. Lamb never elaborated to sort out the problem of Derek? Why had Mr. Lamb not listened that particular problem and acted and reacted differently? I think very clear up to this particular point. People always do that. Wanted to add to that particular point that people always change the topic. Wanted to highlight that particular point that if ever he wanted to highlight his problem in front of anybody, they act and react in the same manner. They immediately change the topic. Why don't you ask me? Wanted to highlight that particular point that why didn't Mr. Lamb ask him? Why you do what they all do and pretend it isn't true and is not there. In case I see you looking and mind and get upset, I will tell you don't ask me because you are afraid to. Just look at the beauty of the words of David. Wanted to inquire from Mr. Lamb that why had he changed the topic. And again, he had added that people do the same. And again, he wanted to add to that particular dialogue that why had he done the same done by other ordinary personalities. Now just look at, in case I see you looking and mind and get upset. Very clear? In case I see you looking and mind and get upset, I will tell you. Wanted to highlight that particular point in case we able to observe that Mr. Lamb was observing him, observing his face and just getting upset immediately. To highlight the point, logical point here, he wanted to highlight that particular point that he would tell, wanted to highlight that particular point that was able to declare that particular point, you don't ask me because you are afraid to. Simple words, Mr. Lamb, you never wanted to elaborate that particular point because underneath you are afraid to look at the face. My face. There he wanted to highlight that particular point that he was afraid to look at his face. Damaged face. You want me to ask? Say so then. Just look at the approach of Mr. Lamb. Just look at the dialogue. Beautiful words of Mr. Lamb. Mr. Lamb was highlighting that particular point. You want me to ask? Say so then. To highlight that particular point that if Derek wanted to elaborate that particular problem of his, and he wanted Mr. Lamb to make a query of that negative part. Negative part was damaged face or scarred face. He wanted to highlight that just he direct must instruct him. I think very clear up to this particular point, there is no doubt in that. I don't like being with people, any people. Just look at the declaration made by Derek. Wanted to highlight that particular point that he didn't like being with people. Any people, he wanted to highlight that particular point. He wanted to be away from humanity due to his handicap. He never wanted to meet anybody. He never wanted to talk to anybody. He never wanted to act and react with anybody. He wanted to be away from humanity. The reason was his negative point, because his face was partially damaged. Half of his face was damaged. So that is why he wanted to be away from humanity, because he used to feel insulted. He had become pessimistic to look at his negative state, Mr. Lamb. I should say, to look at it, I should say you got burned in a fire. Now, at this particular point, Mr. Lamb was able to observe the face of Derry. So, after looking at his face, he was highlighting the words in a very different way. I should say, he would be able to declare that particular point after looking at his face. That Derry had burned in a fire. Due to some fire accident, his face was damaged. Mr. Lamb wanted to highlight a particular point after observing the face of Derek. He wanted to highlight that particular point, that he should be able to declare that particular point, that he means Derek must have got burned in a fire accident. Very clear. No, not in a fire. Was just replying in negative. He was saying that not in a fire. I got acid all down that side of my face and it burned it all away. He wanted to highlight that particular point due to acid, chemical. Chemical had fallen one side of his face. I think you are able to recognize this particular fact, that he was the culprit of some accident. By chance, some accident, some acid had fallen on his face. So that is why one part of his face was totally damaged. It ate my face up. He wanted to highlight that particular point, that it had damaged his face entirely. It ate me up. He wanted to highlight that particular point, that it had just made him 100% pessimistic. It ate me up. I think very clear. He wanted to highlight that particular point, that now he could never ever be able to do anything. And now it's like this, and it won't ever be any different. He wanted to highlight a particular point, that that accident just left permanent marks. Would not be able to get positive. He would not be able to be away from that particular handicap. That particular scar was permanent scar, and could never ever be able to live properly with half face. People would never ever be able to accept him, to observe his half face. I think we are very clear up to this particular point. There is no doubt in that. So now just look at the things. Mr. Lamb, no. Just look at the reply of Mr. Lamb. He was highlighting, no, not at all. And aren't you interested? Just look at the query of Derek here. That if Mr. Lamb was not interested to listen to things, you are a boy who came into the garden. Mr. Lamb wanted to highlight that particular point, that he was the guy who entered into the garden. Plenty do. He wanted to highlight that number of children enter in the garden.